Before we begin with the discussion, we have agreed on giving the speakers the opportunity to deliver some short statements to point out some aspects that they consider relevant for our discussion. Professor Süssmuth, on the 4th of November, 20 years ago from tomorrow, we witnessed the biggest expression of the demand for freedom in the German Democratic Republic, the biggest demonstration under the regime of the SED. 500,000 people gathered, which is now 3 bus stations away from here on the Alexanderplatz. They took the constitution of the GDR as literally as they never dared to do before, and claimed the right that was laid down in Article 27 of that constitution, even in that constitution, the right to express their opinions freely and in public. What would you say can we learn from their struggle for freedom?
Ich denke ja, denn was sich damals ereignet hat, galt in der Mehrheit auch unserer westdeutschen Bevölkerung als nicht realisierbar. Wir gingen davon aus, die Mauer wird auch noch in 10, einige sagten sogar in 100 Jahren stehen. Und am wenigsten wurde es von der früheren DDR erwartet. Hier zeigt sich aber, dass, auch wenn es zunächst nur kleine Gruppen sind, dass die wachsen, wachsen und wachsen können und dass es ein sehr tiefes Bedürfnis der Menschen ist, nach Freiheit und jetzt muss man sagen, auch nach Freiheiten, der Information, der freien Bewegung, die ja doch keineswegs weltweit anerkannt ist und durchgesetzt worden ist, dass es zugleich darum geht, aus der Schwäche zur Stärke zu kommen. Und wir haben ja oft darüber diskutiert in der Bundesrepublik, welche Rolle dabei doch der Austausch von Informationen gespielt hat, beispielsweise das westliche Fernsehen. Und 2 Folgerungen, die ich daraus ziehe, nicht so rasch zu sagen, ja und in China passiert das nie. Und in Iran passiert das nie. Wenn wir allein wüssten, wie viele da im Untergrund unterwegs sind, trotz Wissen um schärfste Verfolgung und Sanktionen. Und ich denke, deswegen ist diese Frage, die uns hier heute bewegt, freie Meinungsäußerung, offene Grenzen in der Information, eine sehr zentrale, die es lohnt, nicht so rasch unter dem Gesichtspunkt, was da alles Gefährliches passieren kann. Das ist auch drin. Freiheit hat immer ein janusköpfiges Gesicht. Scheint mir diese Freiheit unverzichtbar und essentieller Bestandteil einer Demokratie zu sein.
Thank you very much. We will have the chance to come back to what you said later. Mr. Puddepath, I would like to ask you to make the introductory statement.
Thanks very much. Rachel talked earlier about the rather obvious statement in a way that digital communications are transforming and changing lives. And there's a tendency among many people to focus on the tools and see the technology as being about a set of tools. Twitter, Facebook, whatever. The really big change, I think, is not in the tools, but the type of communication model that's emerging. Because in the past, whether it was a cave painting, a wall poster, a newspaper or a broadcast, there was a broadcaster who gave out the content or source of that content, and the rest of us were the audience. And what's changing now is that one-to-many model has evolved and is mutating into a peer-to-peer model when we can all create, we can all contribute, we can all edit, we can all reshape the kind of content that's available out there. And that is a very fundamental change that I think has a number of important implications for the human rights movement. The first is the one that Dean talked about, that the traditional media model is changing, and we don't quite know yet how to develop good quality content access it, edit it, curate it in the very explosion of information that's happening. The second implication is that traditional hierarchies are not very good at using and working with peer-to-peer models. And human rights groups are just as traditional in their hierarchical forms of organisation as are governments and many old-fashioned businesses. So they're struggling to know how to communicate and work in a viral audience and in a viral means with peer-to-peer communications. The third implication is that whereas 20 years ago when I started out as a human rights activist, I didn't really care what kind of paper my newspaper was printed on or what camera shot the TV program that I was watching. Now the pipe that delivers the content in the digital world can change the nature of that content and can determine what content I can see and I can use. So the infrastructure, the connectivity, the applications are just as important to me as a human rights activist as the content itself. And I've got to think about the policies and processes and values that shape that entire ecology and not just the content that I happen to listen to or want to watch. And the big challenge for me is that the digital communications world is a growing and evolving ecology. It's not being controlled by a government. No one person says how it's going to happen. No one group can say how it will change. So for the traditional human rights activist, there's no one government I can lobby. There's no one UN institution. There's no one company I can talk to. I've got to talk to a variety of governments, to a variety of businesses, to a variety of engineers and technologists, and actually most radically and interestingly of all, to vast communities of users who are out there reshaping the digital world, because the digital world is as much a creation of the users as it is of the businesses, the governments, and the engineers. So what we need to find is a way of transmitting or transforming our human rights legal standards and documents and practices into a set of values and principles that we can persuade governments, business, technologists, and user groups to adopt and transform virally as they wish to. So we have to move to an era from, if you like, hard power, to use diplomatic language, to soft power, where we build different kind of alliances with different kinds of organizations, and where the Googles and Yahoos and Microsofts of the world do sit down, as they're doing with the Global Network Initiative, with the human rights organizations to figure out how to promote these values in this transformed environment. If we don't do that, then the people who want to shape the digital world for negative ends, the Chinese, the Burmese, the Iranian governments, but also the Nazis, the paedophiles, and those who want to introduce an uncivil and disruptive discourse will triumph. And those of us who believe in democratic societies, open values, pluralism, diversity, and accessibility, we will be the losers, and we have lost a massive opportunity to transform human society.
Thank you. Mr. Ben-Gharbia, in your daily work as a human rights activist, I think you have to cope with that new media ecology, that new environment that Mr. Puddepath just pointed out to us on a daily basis. How do you cope with it? How does your work try to fit in that new hierarchies and chaos?
Well, from Global Voices' point of view, we think that there are three obstacles to a global conversation online. The first one is linguistic one. Millions of people are blogging in Chinese, but people who do not read Chinese cannot understand what's going on in China online. And the same case for people who do not speak Arabic or people who do not speak Persian or Swahili. So what we do at Global Voices is translating from more than 20 languages into English, accurating that, putting the information into context, and then translating back from English into 20 other languages. The translation is done by human, more than 200 translators, and the authors, more than 250 authors. So we are dealing with the linguistic obstacle. The second one is what we call digital inclusion. Even if people do speak English or speak languages, they do not have access to the internet due to the lack of money, due to the lack of infrastructure. So we have our section, outreach section, which is called Rising Voices is helping marginalized community in the third world to use digital tools. We are training them on how to blog, on how to podcast, and on to build online community and gather around causes like environment, gender, AIDS patient, or minorities. The third and most dangerous obstacle is censorship, and this is where Global Voices Advocacy is trying to deal with. We believe that the traditional approach for traditional NGOs is not enough. We've seen that in few cases, and actually more and more cases, people who break the news about arrest of bloggers are bloggers themselves. They are not NGOs. We've seen this case in Saudi Arabia with the arrest of Weder Farhan, in Morocco with Mohammed Raji, in Tunisia with Zuhair Boukdir, with Zuhair Makhlouf recently. So we thought that let's have our reporters as NGOs. It's not Global Voices that is breaking the news. They have their name. They are the authors of the news. So, and what we've done, we identified the activists who are already taking part in the online free speech movement and trying to highlight what tools they are using and how can we share the same tactics and implement them elsewhere, how Chinese are doing to bypass censorship. Why can we not implement that in Iran or in Tunisia? And that's what we are doing behind the scene. With this new project that we've launched today, in the occasion of this event, this is Threatened Voices, which is a new model of crowdsourcing the information of the arrest of bloggers, online activists, and online journalists. So what people do here, they come here and they can submit reports, because it's very hard. I mean, like countries like Egypt or Iran, they are arresting bloggers every day. Today in Tunisia, we have an online activist who is being tried, Zuhair Makhlouf, for posting a video about environmental issue in Tunisia. Yesterday in Tunisia, 3 bloggers were presented in front of the anti-criminal court to ask them about their online activity. And we are trying to open the reporting mechanism to the crowd. We've seen the success of Wikipedia. We've seen the success of Ushahidi, which is a crisis crowdsourcing mechanism to map what is going on during election or during crisis. And we thought, let's have that model to report on human rights abuse on free speech online.
We've recently seen, for example, in Iran, chances the internet offers to circumvent censorship, and that is something you are working very hard on. Do you think that being online does support the freedom of expression, and is there also a downside? So does the same technology that helps to make these voices heard also helps to control them and to trace them back to people, and then in consequence to punish them maybe in the worst case?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. What we've seen, if we take the case of Iran and we only, I mean, follow the path around what they call Twitter revolution, which things that I don't believe in. It's more buzz and hype than reality. The revolution is taking place in the street, not online. And people who provided the most important and accurate information are coming from inside Iran. But what we've seen on Twitter, and I had access to some studies from Amsterdam University, who studied the behavior of the Iran election as hashtag on Twitter, and most of the tweets are coming from people not from Iran, and basically coming from Western Twitterers, not from Iranian ones. And by changing the time zone, because to show their support on Twitter, people changed their time zone, putting Iran as time zone. They changed their avatar into green, so the world turned into green, which made it quite difficult for the regime to know who are the activists who are tweeting, but made it also difficult for journalists to find the accurate information, because they don't know if this tweet is coming from Iran or from outside the country. But we've seen also some hypocrisy and double standards in defending free speech online. While the world turned green to support the green movement in Iran, we didn't see any support for what is happening now in Tunisia after the election. We've seen that Reporters Sans Frontières is doing a great job denouncing what is going on in Tunisia, arresting bloggers. That Boukdir has been aggressive a few days ago. Tawfiq Ben Bri journalist who is publishing his article mostly online, also on Rue 89, which is a very popular community blog in France. Also, Zuhair Makhlouf has been arrested for disseminating videos online. My own blog has been hacked a week before the election. Another community blog has been hacked a week before the election. Monsef Marzouki website, one of the major opposition leaders, has been hacked. Mukhtar Yahyaoui, blogger and judge, whose blog was hosted by Reporters Sans Frontières, was hacked and deleted completely. We didn't see any support from the world or from the West to our case to democracy. So there is, I think, the online free speech movement is sending very wrong and signal to people who are supporting democracy elsewhere, not in Iran. And I mean, we need to fix this.
Mr. Puddepath, is this imbalance due to some of the effects of the new ecology you were mentioning? The attention that goes somewhere to one place, goes to another place, the difficulty to be neutral, to stay neutral?
No, I don't think it's a new ecology. I think what we're hearing about is a very, like, traditional ecology, that in terms of international attention and international focus, countries like Iran will always attract more interest and more attention than many other countries which have deeply rooted and problems of censorship and control. Tunisia being, a very obvious example because of its complex relationship with the World Summit on Information Society, where I went to Tunisia and encountered an extraordinary level of censorship and control being exercised by the government on Tunisian civil society and Tunisian groups and the independent NGOs who went to Tunis that time. So I think what the new ecology offers is a way to find out about those neglected areas and neglected countries in a way that would not have been possible 20, 25 years ago. Now, it may well be that less is done for the situation in Tunisia than should be, and that may be a disproportionate attention relative to what's done in Iran. But I think under the traditional offline media, that situation would have been even worse 20, 25 years ago, where there would have been relatively limited attention for anything more than a small number of cases at any one time. What the digital environment offers is an opportunity for us to engage in a whole range of ways through a whole different series of means, and increasingly through mobile platforms, and that, I think, only increases the opportunities. What we have to do, and I think this is part of the problem, is the traditional human rights movement has to realise that the nature of the terrain has changed fundamentally. The nature of our allies have changed, the kind of partnerships and collaborations we need to seek has changed, and we cannot go on just operating in our own human rights silos with our own strict methods of working and refusing to engage with a whole range of social actors out there. That, for me, is the problem, that we in the human rights movement haven't caught up with the possibilities that the new ecology offers us.
Mr. Julliard, you mentioned this in your keynote, the privatization of the enemies of freedom of speech. What do you think can be done about that?
Actually, it's true that traditional human rights organizations have to learn a lot from new organizations like Global Voices, because it's a new way to mobilize, it's a new way to convince people to defend human rights. And there is an amazing potential on the internet. Most of the people who go every day on internet, they don't do it to get information about human rights and democracy. Most of the people who use Twitter do it to get news about Britney Spears or this kind of information, but not about democracy and human rights. But at the same time, there is a huge potential, and we have to find ways to use this potential. I think traditional human rights organizations don't find yet a way to attract Facebook users, Twitter users, YouTube users to make more noise about this situation. It's true that we don't speak enough about Tunisia these days, but we should find a way to do it. I mean, people who are going on internet could be as interested by the situation in Tunisia now than they were about the situation in Iran a few months ago. It's also our job as an NGO to convince people to be interested in the situation in Tunisia.
Ms. Süssmuth, you wanted to reply on that? Did I interpret this gesture?
Yes. First, I would like to defend these national NGOs because they, over a long time, they formed the most important power to protect, to defend those who are violating human rights. And let's turn back when we think of the Charter of 77. There was a network without digital communication, and they had a lot of information without the new opportunities. So I think what is necessary, as you said, there are so many regions. We don't know what is happening there. They're in a certain sense forgotten. And I think on both levels, what do have we to learn as politicians, in our committees even? Because it's true. Very often when we speak about the digital communications and the digital tools, it's less applied to human rights movement than to other topics. And they need a kind of support, of advice and learning how to do it. You spoke about what will happen when it's blocked. What can they do? And so we are on one side far on progress, and on the other side, when we speak in terms of human learning, how to manage with these new tools and contents, there is the need for politicians, but there's also need for the NGOs working very hard in the area of human rights. And what can we do? Because at the same time, there be enemies of human rights active within the new digital communication. And we have to see both, because on the one side, they're the barrier how to manage all this information and communication. What is right and what is wrong. But I think it's very important to have this learning process side by side with the new information systems, how to profit from it for a better world.
I think this is a very interesting argument. As promising as these new tools are, as much as they liberate free speech, are we doomed if we rely on them? As they can maybe more easily be blocked, be controlled than traditional media, traditional structures of media. Mr. Gharbia, what would you say? Is it you know how easy those doors can be shut again that you open? Do you think that still that there is a global culture or maybe global networks that will always be able to open these doors again?
Well, I think those who are providing these user-friendly tools like Google, who revolutionized, the way how citizens are expressing themselves with YouTube and with Blogspot, or what Yahoo have done with Flickr or with Yahoo Pipes, or all of this technology and easy-to-use tools are really empowering the citizen. But we hope to see that Google make the access to blogspot.com encrypted through SSL, so it helps protect activists who are blogging anonymously not to be identified in country like China or Tunisia or Syria where Blogspot is blocked. We hope that YouTube won't block any more videos of activists who have broadcasted on-site torture video, like the award for El Abbas, unfortunately have been deleted. His account with more than 100 videos from YouTube just because he was publishing some footage that were deemed sensitive.
Obviously, it doesn't work too good. Technical problems as we're talking about.
We really hope that Google will follow WordPress.com in the way of providing HTTPS access to bloggers. This will really revolutionize the security of the blogger in country engaged in censorship and persecution of blogger. I think it's very important to secure Blogspot.
Mr. Puddepath, you wanted to reply on
questions? No, I think that the modern digital technology is far better than the traditional communication technologies, be they newspapers or broadcast. I mean, this is the world's dominant platform for delivering content in the global south, or it will become the dominant platform. Most people in the world now have one of these, or have access to one of these, or will have one of these mobile phones in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm working with a German technologist who can build a wireless transmitter that can deliver wireless broadband over 100 kilometers for $40. And we could roll that out in pretty much any environment you choose to have around the world. And I can listen on my mobile phone to a radio station that's made in Florida and uploaded in the Ukraine. This is the capability of accessing content that would not have been possible, 40 years ago. Satellite broadcasting made one big change, which was one of the big reasons why I think many of the democratic changes of 20 years ago happened, because people had access to satellite television, satellite broadcasting. The cell phone technology of the next 20 years will bring a similar scale of transformation. And there is a tremendous possibility for Democrats and human rights activists in the kind of access to communications that we will have over the next 10, 20 years, particularly if we build the right open platforms on the mobile phone to access the digital networks.
So decentralization is the clue to that.
Decentralization.
Can't just be switched off.
Multiple applications, decentralization, and very cheap, very accessible infrastructure, which you can roll out in almost any environment at extremely low cost. And we are now at the point of delivering low-cost broadband in the remotest rural areas for $40 or $50 a time. That, for a development, for Europeans who invest in development, it would be the best investment we could make in the global south to roll out a global infrastructure.
Yeah, just to keep in mind that there are still some very strong borders and very strong walls to break in the world. And I'm speaking about some black holes in the world, countries where people don't have any access to internet, people don't have any access to this digital revolution we are speaking about. In countries like North Korea, Eritrea in Africa, Turkmenistan in Central Asia, and a few places like this, people don't have any access to internet, any access to Twitter, Facebook, Google, and everything. So we still have to fight against these political borders and these very, very repressive governments, because we can try to defend bloggers in Iran, to speak about human rights record in Tunisia, but we don't have to forget these very unknown places in the world. Even with internet now, there are still some places we don't really know about what is going on over there.
One of the problems, I guess, to open up these countries is that they are not really taking part in the global economy, for example, in global architecture. So if we talked about before that economy may be our ally on promoting freedom of speech, that's going to be difficult in a country like North Korea, probably. But Ms. Süssmuth, what can policymakers do to promote freedom of speech, to support the activists and human rights movements?
First of all, I think to have another discussion than we often have, and that And that means that very often we are in favor and against. And if we have difficulties, there's very often the very quick reaction, stop it. And when we start in our Western democracies to stop it, that had long-time consequences for worldwide information. That's one. The kind of leadership we take here, very responsible, and therefore I'm very glad that we don't only speak about tools, but also about contents. That's the challenge. Second, I think we speak a lot of infrastructure in those areas you are talking about. And when we discuss what is our support in these countries, then it's this kind of infrastructure. To have access to information, to have access to these tools, because as we know, maybe in Africa as well as in East Asia or in Latin America, human beings are quick learners when you promote it. And therefore it's a task of politics to promote this kind of new possibilities. We often say, how can they take share? Can they share our information? How can they participate? Give them our tools and let them participate. So those are my two answers to that. And third, I would say I'm not convinced that the human rights activists really have a broad support. It's more for Sunday speeches than to do it in reality. And that's what we have to promote more and more. That's really a crime, I would say a crime. Not.
You would say internationally they don't have broad support, or they by politicians in general, who is not giving them?
No, it's not politicians in general. That's too easy.
I'm sorry for that.
But it's very often that you have this bias. Yes, there's a lack of human rights, but you have to understand the system, and we have to make business with them. So it's very difficult. Remember the Olympics, China. How to deal with human rights. And I can tell you from my experience when it deals with migration and integration, human rights don't seem attractive, neither for the countries of origin nor in the receiving countries. There we have to solve a lot of problems in both countries.
What strikes me about the traditional offline media is that since 1945, we drove through the offline media, we kept the Nazis and the fascists out of the media. It was very difficult for Nazis and fascists to get a platform on the traditional media. And I think one of the consequences that human rights activists, progressive people, lost the ability, somewhere away, or the confidence to argue with fascists. So when now they're coming back, and they're coming back all over Europe, and they're winning elections, and they're getting back into the mainstream media, and Rachel referred to a big debate about the British National Party, the British Fascist Party appearing on a major British television show. What struck me was the lack of confidence among the Democrat and human rights movement that we could go out there and argue with a fascist and beat them in argument and beat them in debate, which we can. You know, if we don't have the confidence to believe that we can take on the Nazis and the fascists in open discussion, open debate, what is wrong with us? You know, if there's something that we ought to be able to do as Democrats with our history is defeat fascists in debate, we should be able to. And the digital world is bringing them back. You know, you can censor them in a mainstream media, but you can't censor them on the web. They're very organized, they're very active, and like most transgressive groups, they're very good at being on the web. So we have to now debate with them and argue with them and roll them back in open discussion and debate. And that's something we've not had to do, and that's something that I worry that we in the human rights movement have lost our confidence and our ability in doing, and I think we need to regain that fast.
So you would say, you would say that some prohibitions we have, for example, here in Germany, talking about certain stuff, are rather in the way of standing in our way to access openly or to confront openly the problems we have.
Well, it's difficult for me to come to Germany and say you shouldn't have laws banning the Nazis and Holocaust denial, because there's a history here that you've navigated, I think, extraordinarily well. As a country, to reinvent yourselves in the way that Germans have reinvented themselves is a fantastic modern achievement. But I think with the kind of information environment that we're that's evolving, it's not that we're creating it, it's evolving, it's happening. They are there, they have to be engaged with, they have to be debated with, and the traditional tools of us censoring them in a good cause that we relied upon for maybe 30 or 40 years, I would simply say we can't rely upon that now. We have to learn how to re-engage in those debates and those discussions, because in the digital world they are happening, and they're happening in a very organised way. And that just gives us a challenge we haven't had to face in the previous generation, but this new generation will have to face. And I think we should embrace it. Why should we be afraid of a fascist and an arguing with a fascist? I see nothing to be afraid of in anything they say.
Mr. Gharbia, what do you say how to cope with diverging criteria of freedom of speech? I mean, we seem to have a consensus here about certain things, but if we look at the UN, for example, who passed a resolution on defamation laws, 2008, then the global consensus seems to be a bit different than the one we have here. They seem to favor certain cultural identities, cultural sensibilities in contrast to the freedom of speech.
Yeah, I think we should strongly denounce that. I think we need to be principled about supporting free speech for everybody, even for those who do not share our democratic values or ideology. Bloggers in Iran, like, let's name one name, Hudar, which is the blog father of the Persian blog sphere. Hossein Dirakhshan is now in jail for 1 year, and there is a lot of debate whether to support him or no. Why? For the simple reason, because Hossein Dirakhshan, who helped shape actually the power of the Iranian blog sphere, supported Ahmadinejad in his blog writing. And people are skeptical about supporting him and refusing to supporting him. And I think this is dangerous. If we support a secularist blogger like Karim Amr, who is being in jail for more than 2 years now, and for insulting Islam, and Hosni Mubarak, the president, we should also allow ourselves to defend Islamist blogger, Muslim Brotherhood bloggers, anyone who is expressing himself peacefully online.
Well, I think the obvious starting point is that the limits on free speech, and it's not an absolute right, you're quite right, there are limits, are those where it's necessary for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. And within the human rights framework, there is, if you like, a balance to be struck between the rights to free expression and the rights of other people to exercise those rights. So it's very clear, there's some very clear boundaries, like inciting violence is not protected speech. Inciting hatred is a more complex one, because in some societies people will argue that the expression of a strong political belief is tantamount to the incitement of hatred rather than the expression of a belief. And I think there it's much more a case-by-case basis as to what the context is before you can judge the Speech Act. I mean, we can all say, I feel like killing someone, and in some contexts that's a completely innocent expression of frustration at the end of a phone call with the delivery company. But in another context, I feel like killing someone could mean a serious act of incitement towards someone else. So there are some context-dependent things, but I think that if you take the approach of international human rights jurisprudence over the last 50 or 60 years, the absolute standards, the absolute prohibitions, and the relative standards in case law has been pretty well excavated in most circumstances, and I'm reasonably comfortable with the kind of jurisprudence that's evolved, or the court of judgments have been made by something like the European Court of Human Rights. Some I disagree with, some I don't agree with, you know, some etc. But I think the balance is there within the human rights framework. Outside of that, I don't know where you draw the line.
Yes, it is the same. It is the same for us. We don't have any specific rules because it's completely impossible to have some rules, and we have to decide case by case. Because, for instance, of course, we won't defend a journalist who incites to kill someone else. It's not a matter of press freedom anymore. It's a crime. But incitement to hatred, what is it? I mean, the answer will be very different here in Germany or in European countries and in Rwanda, for instance, or in very violent countries. So it's very hard to answer this question, and we have to decide case by case, depending on the context, depending on the situation. You all remember the affair of the cartoon, Mohammed cartoons. It was very hard to have a position, to have to make a statement about this issue, because even us internally, I mean, within the staff of Reporters Without Borders, we don't agree about our statement about this affair. So it means that it was very sensitive.
Auch wenn Sie sagen, es gibt keine festen Regeln, so muss es doch eine permanente Auseinandersetzung darum geben, was akzeptabel und nicht akzeptabel ist. Denn sonst wird alles relativ. In einem Fall ist der Hass akzeptiert, im anderen nicht. Es geht ja auch in der Auslegung unseres Grundgesetzes darum, dass wir die ersten 19 Artikel nicht beliebig verändern können. Also ich rede hier gegen die Beliebigkeit, denn neben dem Grundrecht auf freie Meinungsäußerung gibt es den Grundrechtsartikel der Menschenwürde. Und die Fälle, die Sie eben genannt haben, verstoßen massiv gegen die Menschenwürde. Ich bin sehr einverstanden mit dem, was gesagt wurde, dass wir uns inzwischen in unserer Wertedebatte nicht mehr wagen und uns auch nicht mehr auseinandersetzen. Mal gehen wir Islamisten aus dem Weg, mal gehen wir den Rechtsextremisten aus dem Weg, und zu unserer Kultur muss gehören die aktive Auseinandersetzung. Also zu glauben, das überholt sich von selbst und wir bleiben in der Mehrheit, davon können wir nicht ausgehen. Umgekehrt ist es notwendig, wenn ich den Europäischen Menschengerichtshof nehme, dann hilft mir das, diese Case Studies, die Fälle zu haben, an denen ich mich ausrichte. Aber ich warne davor, dass wir das jeweils neu entscheiden und nicht bestimmte Grundprinzipien haben, von denen wir eigentlich einen Konsens brauchen, dass Mord ist und nicht akzeptiert werden kann, dass Gewalt nicht akzeptiert werden kann. Sonst kommen wir in einen Relativismus hinein, der keine Grenzen mehr hat.
And I think privacy is something that we earn and we do love to protect. But I think there is enough tools online if you are using Firefox and you are technically knowledgeable enough about how to protect yourself. You can really find a good way to be anonymous completely online. And at Global Voice Advocacy, we promote the use of Tor, which is a very powerful circumvention and anonymous tools that is being used by activists. It's true that it's very slow, but it's really block Google Ads. It blocks all Flash content. It blocks everything. So I really support the use of Tor, and only Tor.
Yes, please.
I think privacy is an interesting issue, because I think what's happening, again, Rachel talks about the immense cheapness of storage. and that with the digital world, essentially nothing's ever forgotten. And someone's written a book about this recently. I was reading the reviews on the FT on the way over. And so any transaction, any interaction I have in an online world can be captured and recorded and held. And sometimes, you know, companies, that creates a source of data that's commercially very interesting, commercially very lively. And sometimes that can be for my good. If I go onto Amazon, it remembers me, it remembers every transaction, and it comes back and suggests things I might want to listen to and might want to read. Equally, with the health service in my own country, it would be to my advantage. I would choose to have my health records shared among the health service because I want to be able to go to any doctor in any part of the country and have them access my medical records online to give me better treatment if I need it. I think somewhere there's a principle of informed consent, that we need to make it clearer that if you use services, we perhaps need to find ways of saying, I will consent to my data being shared and being accessed for purposes that I think I might benefit from. But where I don't wish to consent to do that, then I don't choose to engage with that environment. But it's an issue that requires, I think, a lot of discussion. It will reflect changing values. Different countries value privacy more than others. Generations value privacy more than others. My daughter's generation has no great interest in personal privacy of the way that I would have an interest in privacy. You know, it's simply social mores are changing. So it's a complex area. It is an important area, but one where I would say the principle of informed consent is the way into the discussion.
But I think the objection would be it is not always your choice, or it should be your choice, but sometimes governments choose for you. They pass anti-terrorism laws sometimes.
They did that in the offline world.
Yeah, well, that doesn't make it any.
No.
It doesn't change the problem.
Sure.
Ich habe ja eben schon mal gesagt, was ich für dringlich halte in unsere gesamte dem Bereich, ich nenne das heute nicht mehr Entwicklungshilfe, sondern Zusammenarbeit, weil das sonst so einseitig ist, dass wir wirklich diesen Teilhabe an Information, Kommunikation, wenn wir an den gesamten Bereich denken von Wireless heute, dann gibt es Möglichkeiten, die wir vor ein paar Jahren nicht hatten. Und dies wirklich hineinzubringen in diese Region. Denn Sie finden in all diesen Ländern manchmal sehr klein und wurzelhaft Gruppen, die aus diesem Elend heraus wollen und die auch über ihre Bedürfnisse, über ihre Möglichkeiten reden wollen. Und das gehört mit zu der Unterstützung, die wir ihnen bringen. Das ist eins. Das andere ist, dass wir Europäer, dass wir Amerikaner und andere, die dazugehören, das auch wirklich wollen, dass sie teilhaben. Denn mitunter ist ja sehr strittig. Dass wir darüber reden, heißt ja noch nicht, dass wir wollen, dass sie an Weltmärkten teilhaben, dass sie an Bildung teilhaben. Einige wollen das, andere wollen das nicht. Also es gehört auch zu unserer europäischen Tradition, dass wir Menschen sehr lange in Abhängigkeiten gehalten haben. Mir ist es genauso wichtig, wie nur zu fragen, wie bringen wir die Tools dorthin. Wir brauchen beides. Und bisher ist diese Frage ja immer noch im Streit. Nehmen Sie jetzt für Kopenhagen die Frage, wir haben uns in der EU nicht festgelegt, in welcher Weise wir beim Klimawandel.
Okay, it's getting late, even though you try to wake up people. I would like to thank you all for your participation here and for your contribution. Thank you for your attention.